Hey there. Ready for a deep dive into Cal Newport's deep work? We've got some really fascinating excerpts from his book here. It's a blend of research, stories, advice, all about how to really focus in a world that's constantly trying to distract us.
It's definitely a timely topic. One of the things I find so interesting about Newport's approach is how he links this idea of deep work directly to success, especially in the modern economy.
Totally. Like he starts off with this example of Nate Silver, the stats guy, who pretty much predicted the entire 2012 election with data.
hmm
And what was his secret? Not some fancy algorithm, but this ability to work deeply with really complex tools.
Exactly. And this is where Newport goes beyond just, individual productivity acts. He argues that in the world we live in now, three groups are really thriving. Those who figured out how to work effectively with intelligent machines, AI, advanced software, crunching huge amounts of data. Then there are the superstars at the very top of their fields, and of course, those with access to capital. And his point is that deep work is like the key to potentially joining at least one of those groups.
So deep work isn't just about getting more stuff done. It's almost like a prerequisite for reaching a certain level of success these days,
Yeah, precisely. It's about this ability to focus intensely, master really difficult things, which is what sets those groups apart, especially in the information age.
which actually kind of makes you wonder, if deep work is so valuable, why aren't more people doing it? Newport tells this story about Tom Cochran, a CTO who realized his company was spending over $1 million a year just on email.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Talk about a black hole of like shallow work.
Right. So much of what we do all day, it feels productive, emails, meetings, always being on, but is it actually moving the needle on what really matters?
That's the problem. Shallow work often feels really productive, but in reality,
It can be deceiving. I love how Newport calls this the metric black hole of knowledge work, because it's hard to, actually measure deep thinking. We gravitate toward these shallow tasks that have these easily quantifiable results. Like sending 20 emails feels a lot more concrete than, I don't know, pondering the nature of the universe.
it's true. And it creates this pressure to be seen as busy, which actually brings up an interesting point. What about someone like Jack Dorsey, running Twitter and Square? You'd think he'd be like the poster child for constant connection, not deep work.
Yeah,
Right.
good point. It almost feels like he completely contradicts everything we've just been talking about.
Right. But New Quote points out this key difference. Dorsey's job is essentially being a human decision engine. He's constantly taking in information and making calls, and that's very specific to what he does.
So for those of us who aren't, tech CEOs, endlessly scrolling and task switching isn't actually a job requirement. It's probably holding us back.
Exactly. For most of us, especially in fields that require real deep thinking, distraction is the enemy of productivity, not its fuel.
This is where I find Newport's ideas about these different deep work philosophies so helpful. He seems to get that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Like there's the monastic approach, total seclusion, like Donald Knuth, the computer science legend. He famously refuses to use email.
Yes, but then there's the bimodal philosophy. It's this really fascinating idea where you alternate between periods of intense, isolated work and periods of, more typical engagement. Carl Jung is a great example. He'd spend weeks at his retreat completely focused on writing, and then he'd go back to Zurich and be really active in the intellectual scene there.
Ooh, that's such an interesting contrast. Which one resonates more with you?
I think for me, honestly, I find elements of both to be incredibly helpful depending on the project and what stage of work I'm in. But I think the key takeaway for me really is just intentionality. You have to be deliberate about carving out time for deep work and then really fiercely protect that time from the never-ending demands of shallow work.
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting for me, the idea that we can actually train our attention. Newport argues that focus is like a muscle. You have to exercise it. He talks about this thing he calls productive meditation, basically using walks, commutes, even just doing the dishes to really chew on a problem.
Cool.
Have you experimented with that at all?
Oh, all the time. It's incredibly effective. The key is to not just replay the same old tired thoughts, right? You have to kind of force yourself to go deeper, look for new angles, make connections you might not otherwise.
And he has some pretty unconventional suggestions too. Like he suggests memorizing a deck of cards, which on the surface sounds a little out there.
Right, but it's brilliant. It's about strengthening those concentration muscles, like weightlifting for your mind. The more you practice focusing intensely, even on something seemingly random, the better you get at it.
It's almost counterintuitive. We think of deep work as this very intellectual pursuit, but it's fundamentally tied to our brain's actual physical capacity to focus.
Exactly. And speaking of counterintuitive, Newport tells this great story about Baratund Thurston, a comedian who did a complete internet fast for 25 days, which is, extreme.
That's hardcore.
But it really highlights how much we let these tools kind of dominate our lives without even realizing it.
It's so true. We're so used to being constantly connected that we rarely, if ever, stop to think about whether these tools are actually serving us or if they're just hijacking our attention for their own purposes.
Totally. Which leads us to what Newport calls the craftsman approach to technology. It's this idea that we should be really deliberate about the tools we use, and we should ask ourselves, does this tool truly support my most important goals? Not just, any random benefit.
It's like you wouldn't use a hammer to build a delicate piece of furniture, right? Even if it's the only tool you have in front of you, you would carefully select the right tool for the job, even if it takes more time or effort. So why wouldn't we apply that same thinking to our digital tools?
Exactly. It's about being intentional and recognizing that sometimes the most powerful tool is actually saying no.
Ooh, I like that. But before we dive into the power of saying no, let's take a quick pause and come back to explore some of the specific tactics that Newport recommends for actually building a deep work practice. Okay, so we're back and ready to get into some of Newport's more tactical advice. Because it's one thing to say, hey, everyone, focus more. But how do we actually make that happen?
Right. That's where it gets really interesting. One of the things that really stood out to me was this idea of actually scheduling every minute of your day.
Whoa, every minute. That sounds a little intense. Like I need a personal assistant following me around with a stopwatch.
It's not about being that rigid. It's more about awareness, right? You'd be amazed how much time just kind of disappears when you're not really paying attention to it. Newport talks about this study in Britain where they asked people to estimate how much TV they watched, and people were way off.
Oh, I believe that. I'm probably guilty of that myself.
It's so easy to do.
So by actually plotting out your day, you're forcing yourself to confront the reality of how you're spending your time.
Yes, exactly. And often just seeing where that shallow work is hiding, it allows you to start strategically eliminating it or at least minimizing it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But then once you've cleared some space, how do you actually fill it with deep work? Because, I can tell myself to focus, but that doesn't always,
Yeah.
work.
Right. And that's where this idea of fixed schedule productivity comes in. Have you heard of this?
I think so.
Okay. So it's basically about setting a firm end time to your workday and then working backward. You figure out how to get the most important work done within those constraints.
So it's almost like Parkinson's law in reverse.
Yeah.
Instead of the work expanding to fill the time, you're defining the time to focus the work.
Yes, exactly. It's counterintuitive, but by actually limiting your work hours, you often end up being more efficient because you're forced to really ruthlessly prioritize.
It's like that saying, work expands to fill the time allotted or something like that.
Exactly.
He makes a really interesting case for this, especially in academia, where there's this glorification of long hours,
Oh, totally. Working yourself to the bone is a badge of honor.
Yeah.
But as Newport points out, there's a point of diminishing returns. You can only do really high quality deep work for so long before you just burn out.
Oh, 100%. So it's about working smarter, not necessarily longer.
Exactly. And a crucial part of that is honestly learning to become a little bit harder to reach, which I know can be a really hard shift to make, but it's about setting those boundaries around your time and attention, even if it feels a little bit, uncomfortable at first.
It does, especially in a world where we're expected to be constantly available.
Right.
I do love how he talks about having that sender filter for your email, basically making people jump through a couple hoops to contact you, unless it's actually a true emergency.
Yes, love that. It forces people to be more thoughtful about their requests, and it weeds out so much unnecessary back and forth.
I also love that he suggests sometimes just not responding to emails. He mentions that some really successful academics do this, and it actually enhances their reputation.
Isn't that wild? But it makes sense, right?
It does.
It's like the signal that your time and attention are valuable. You don't just give them away to anyone who asks.
It's not about being rude. It's about being strategic and valuing your time. And actually, when you think about it, it kind of shows other people that their time is valuable too.
Exactly. Because every email you send, every email you receive, it's a potential distraction. It pulls you away from that deep work that really matters.
Okay, so We talked about scheduling our time. We've talked about being harder to reach and being really ruthless about minimizing that shallow work. But what about the actual, like, focus part? How do you get better at actually going deep in the first place?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And this is where Newport's rule #2 comes in. Embrace boredom.
Wait, embrace boredom. That sounds counterintuitive to say the least.
It does, doesn't it? But it's not about boredom for boredom's sake. It's about training your mind to resist distraction and build that capacity for, like, sustained focus. Think of it like, mental endurance training.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. He gives that example of, like, Orthodox Jews who study the Talmud for hours every day,
Right,
right?
Sess. Exactly. It's this incredibly demanding practice that requires immense concentration, and they cultivate that ability from a really young age.
It's like they're doing mental weightlifting, basically.
Basically.
And then he talks about how, like, constantly filling every free moment with our phones, scrolling social media, checking news feeds is actually rewiring our brains to crave distraction.
Yes, 100%. It's like we've become addicted to novelty and stimulation. We've lost the ability, or maybe we never even developed the ability, to
Right.
just be,
Yeah.
even for a little bit. And when you're wired that way, deep work becomes almost impossible.
So then how do we break the cycle?
Mm.
How do we, like, wean ourselves off this addiction to distraction?
Well, Newport has a few suggestions, and some of them are a little radical. Like he talks about the internet Sabbath, which is exactly what it says.
So it's like a digital detox.
Yes, you disconnect completely for a set period of time. It could be a day, a weekend, and it gives your brain a chance to kind of reset, to rediscover its natural ability to focus without that constant bombardment of, like, notifications and updates and everything.
I like that. And it doesn't have to be this, like, massive commitment, right? He also talks about doing, like, shorter internet blocks throughout the day instead of constantly checking in.
Exactly. It's about creating those clear boundaries between your deep work time and that online world instead of just letting them constantly bleed into each other.
Right, right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But here's what I'm wondering. When you are offline, when you have embraced the boredom, so to speak, what do you actually do?
That is a great question, and it kind of leads us to this practice that Newport calls productive meditation. It's about using those in-between moments, walks, commutes, even just standing in line at the grocery store to actively think about a problem.
He talks about, like, working out entire chapter outlines while walking across that bridge in Boston, right? The
Huh.
Longfellow Bridge.
Exactly. It's amazing what your mind can do when you give it that space to wander and explore without the constraints of, a screen or a keyboard.
I love that image. And it makes me realize, like, how often I'm trying to, like, distract myself from those kind of boring moments instead of leaning into them.
It's so common, but those moments can be so fertile for deep thinking and problem solving. You just have to resist the urge to fill them with something else.
This has been so insightful. I feel like we've covered so much ground already. But I think we need to take one more quick pause to really absorb all of this deep work wisdom. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to finish our deep dive into deep work.
All right, so we are back and ready to tackle Newport's final rule. Drain the shallows. This feels like where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, how do we actually put all this deep work stuff into practice?
It is. And I appreciate that Newport acknowledges that shallow work can't be, like, completely eliminated. We all have emails we need to deal with, meetings to go to, those little administrative tasks that just need to get done.
It's not about becoming, like, a monk in a cave somewhere.
Exactly.
So it's more about, like, minimizing the shallows as much as possible so we can really maximize the deep work.
Precisely. Being way more intentional with how you spend your time and energy, making sure that the shallow stuff doesn't end up crowding out the truly high-value work.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how do we do that? Because I
Right.
know, like, I'm definitely guilty of letting those shallow tasks eat up way too much of my day. Well, one really interesting tactic that Newport talks about is this idea of quantifying your depth, which sounds a little intimidating, but it's actually pretty simple. Basically, you ask yourself, for any given task, how long would it take me to train, say, a recent college graduate to do this?
Oh, interesting. I think I see where you're going with this.
Right. So if it's something that you could pretty easily hand off to someone with no specialized knowledge, it's probably not the best use of your unique skills and experience.
Whereas if it would take, like, months or even years to train someone else to do it at the same level, then you're probably dealing with something that requires real deep work and concentration.
Exactly. It's about ruthlessly focusing on those activities that really move the needle, the ones that actually require, that hard-won experience and knowledge that you've built up.
Okay, yeah, that's a really helpful framework for thinking about it. And it kind of reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with scheduling every minute of your day.
Yeah.
Not to be like obsessive about it, but just to really see where those pockets of shallow work are hiding.
It's all connected, right? It's about awareness, it's about intentionality, and then making really conscious choices about how you spend that most precious resource,
Yeah.
your attention.
Yes. And a huge part of that seems to be around setting boundaries, becoming that a little bit harder to reach.
Absolutely. Like those academics we talked about who just don't respond to emails sometimes.
That's kind of a power move when you think about it.
It is.
And it's not just about what you don't do, it's also about what you do do. Like when you do send emails, making them really thoughtful and comprehensive so you're not creating more back and forth.
Yes, exactly. It's that proactiveness. You're being efficient with your communication instead of constantly just reacting and getting pulled in different directions.
So it really does all come back to that idea of treating your time and your attention as the truly precious resources they are.
Mm.
Like they're finite. You can't get them back once they're gone, so don't waste them on shallow, low-impact tasks.
And one of the best ways to do that, which kind of goes back to something we were discussing earlier, is that idea of fixed schedule productivity. Setting that firm end time for your workday. And then you work backwards to figure out how to fit the important stuff into those boundaries.
Working smarter, not harder.
Yes. And it forces you to prioritize, be laser focused on what truly matters, and just let go of the rest, which is so much easier said than done, of course.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I feel like we have covered so much ground in this deep dive, from, understanding the value of deep work in the world today to exploring all sorts of different strategies for cultivating focus and eliminating distractions and really maximizing that deep work potential. This has been really, really eye-opening for me.
It has been fascinating. It's such a powerful set of ideas, and you can tell they're really relevant, I think, to so many people trying to do meaningful work.
And I love how Newport argues that deep work isn't just about productivity for productivity's sake. It's not just about getting more stuff done. It's about living a more meaningful and fulfilling life overall.
Absolutely. Doing work that truly matters, work that you find challenging and engaging, and that really makes a difference in the world. What could be better than that?
I know, right? So here's a final thought to kind of carry with you as you go forth on your deep work journey. What could you achieve if you are able to consistently tap into that state of flow and focus? How might your life change if you really committed to making deep work a priority? It's a question worth exploring. And hopefully this deep dive has given you the tools and the inspiration to start finding your own answers.